Trey, do you want to lead us into our topic for the week?
Sure. Struggled to how to define this exactly. But I'll just say I started thinking I played a bunch of Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion. I met up with a good buddy of mine in Austin, and he's at home and can't really work right now because he's going through chemotherapy. And so he wants to nerd, and so we got some serious nerding in, and so I'd finally got a chance to play Gloomhaven, and Jaws of the Lion, with its focus on being accessible to new players and that it teaches you while you play, was here was my chance to play this. And I'd say it went really well. I had a good time. He really enjoyed it. I still think that Gloomhaven's not exactly my kind of game, but I see what the big deal is now. And I think, it's a really good game, and it does a really good job of teaching you the game as you play it. And so I went back and I re-listened to your review with Jesse, however many weeks ago that was. And I would say that I think my reaction to the game was very similar to yours. Anyway, I was just starting to think about the mechanics in that game, and at first I was thinking maybe I should do something about because I'm always talking about randomness. Even Dimitri's talks about me talking about randomness and input randomness and output randomness, and just these are interesting design decisions that go into games. And I guess maybe I would start off by saying is Gloomhaven a deck builder? What do we mean when we talk about deck building? Do you consider Gloomhaven?
I wouldn't consider it a typical deck builder in that you are really only building a deck maybe once every other scenario, and by building you're just sort of adding one card that can slightly change the tone. Over time you can drastically change the way your character plays, but it takes a while. I also think you have your whole hand of cards available to you. I mean, the only real deck building is before a scenario, you have to pick the cards that you're going to take into that scenario. That's the deck building. Then you have your whole hand available to you. So if you were shuffling it up and drawing a couple cards each turn, and there was more randomness there, to me, then that would be, I guess to me, when I think deck builder, I think a constantly evolving deck, but also a huge amount of randomness and luck based on, hoping that I've figured out the probabilities correctly so that I'm drawing what I need when I need it.
So I think you just said a bunch of stuff there that goes into how you play Gloomhaven, and maybe what I want to do is to go into more detail. All those distinctions that you just made, I think are really important. And my point in this discussion is not to actually say this is deck building and this is deck construction and this is hand management and that these are firm rules. They're not. I think they're actually just really interesting design decisions that you're talking about. So we're going to talk about Gloomhaven here. I don't think that any of this is going to be spoilers, because we'll just talk about general mechanics here. But as you level up in Gloomhaven, when you first play the game, especially Jaws of the Lion, I think you start with 6 cards. It's basic. It's super basic, just so you can kind of learn the rules. Yeah. And then as you start to level up, you get the point where okay, now I'm getting my first level cards and I get all of them. And then I think maybe it's either level 2 or level 3 where you, for the first time, you have to decide, I have an option of 2 cards here, and I'm going to choose one of these things. And it's not that I'm ruling out that I won't ever get the second one, but I'm making an actual decision about what kind of character I'm going to be at that point. And so
you can get it later, but it will be at the cost of getting a better card, probably.
A card that's probably better. So
yeah.
Even though it doesn't explicitly mean you're leaving it behind, you probably are, because the opportunity cost of taking a better card is too high for you to go back and take that other level 2 card. So in terms of just how this actually breaks down now, so you're now starting to build up an ever expanding set of action options in terms of the cards that you play in Gloomhaven, but you actually have a hand cap, right? Like depending on the actual role you're playing in the game, this cap's even different. Like I remember I played Red Guard, there was a 10 card cap on this, whereas my buddy was playing Demolitionist and he always had to deal with 9. And that distinction made a big difference in terms of like I had a lot more endurance in the scenarios, whereas he tended to kind of flame out, and like he was not necessarily in danger of dying from hit points, but he was always in danger of being exhausted just from playing cards in that game. So the distinction you were making then is like, okay, I'm going into a new scenario. I've got, 16 cards to choose from, and I've got to get it down to 9. Right. So what I'm going to refer to now are the mechanisms that BGG is using. If we've talked about this a little bit before, but like Board Game Geek now has an entire section devoted to mechanics, and by the way, they don't call it mechanisms. So that debate, I guess, is kind of, BGG is going to call it mechanics. So whatever, but this is all based upon, I think that they've just lifted the distinctions that Jeff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev identified in their book, Building Blocks of Game Design, which I think came out last year. And this is a book that people can get, and I'll put a link to it in show notes. And I even have I've got a set of cards that has the mechanisms on it, so you can kind of use this if you're a budding game designer, or even just to see what these distinctions are. But so anyway, using BGG's own terms, I think the idea of I have 14 cards and I now need to make my deck of 9, like that would be deck construction as a mechanic. And I the prime example of deck construction would be a game like Magic the Gathering, right? Where you've got access to a large card pool. Whether it's Magic, these are cards that you've purchased, and some of them are rarer than others, or whatever, and then you have to make a deck from that. That's deck construction. Or then if it's an LCG like Game of Thrones or Netrunner, you can kind of have access to the entire pool as long as you've purchased it. But those decisions of what you do to put into your deck, that can be a very rich thing just to begin with. And that's an important part of Gloomhaven. So BGG also, their actual definition of deck building is when players play cards out of individual decks, seeking to acquire new cards and play through their decks iteratively, improving them over time through card acquisition. And this would also cover things like bag building from other games that we play like that. The best example not TREY, but Orleans would be one, right? And
or Paladins of the West Kingdom does the same thing.
Yep. And then what's the bag builder that's the potion one?
Quacks of Quedlinburg. Yeah,
Quacks of Quedlinburg.
Oh, right. Yeah. No. Yeah. Sorry. The Paladins does not do what you're talking about. Yeah, but Quacks is. Yeah.
So the thing is when you look at that definition, when we play Concordia, we all start out with the same, I think, 7 action cards or whatever it is. And then we start to become asymmetrical as we acquire more cards from that, as an action where we can buy more cards. But even that, that would be, I think, what we would call, or what BGG would call, card drafting. Okay. And so card drafting are games in which players pick cards from a limited subset, such as a common pool to gain some advantage, intermediate or long term, or to assemble hands of cards that can be used to meet objectives in the games. So that would be things like Through the Ages, Concordia, and then I guess St. Petersburg was the first one to do that. And even that might be, and so I guess the distinction they're going to make in terms of card drafting is, there's a pool of cards out there and you're making a decision about what you're going to take. And there might be some stuff that's more expensive, but it's a common thing that we're competing for. And that may even be different from, I don't know, in Seven Wonders, we're drafting cards, right? But you're not, but it's kind of here's your set. Now choose one, then pass. Right. So maybe the final mechanism that kind of fits into this area is what BGG is calling hand management. And Jennifer talked with me a little bit, or messaged me earlier this week talking about how she does not like hand management games, even though, and then she went and looked, and a lot of her favorite games are flagged on BGG as hand management games.
Yeah. Give me a breakdown of hand management.
So the way they define hand management are games with cards in them that reward players for playing cards in certain sequences or groups. Um, so I think what they're talking about in hand management, and again, this is totally Gloomhaven.
That sounds like Gloomhaven to a T.
Yes, but it's also Concordia, right? Because you're looking at your
Mm-hmm.
hand and you're saying, what's the thing I want to play right now? But even then, I may be balancing of like, listen, this, it may be good to play this card right now, but it might be better if I wait. Like in, so the
Like teach you
sequencing,
also, right?
what's that?
Like teach you also, right?
Yeah, I guess in determining on what you want to lead, yeah, that would
Or
absolutely be hand.
the order that you
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
play
yeah.
them.
No, absolutely. Teach you would totally be hand. I mean, a lot of those card games.
Yeah.
This is a generic mechanism here, but it's saying like I'm looking at my hand and I'm making decisions about what cards I'm playing from my hand. That's hand management.
Yeah.
So maybe the thing to that takes that is going back to like the distinction you were making on what makes something a deck builder, and I don't think there's necessarily a word for this, but like there's a thing that Dominion does and that Viscounts did, which is it put in this intermediate step where like when we play Concordia and we play the Tribune card, we get all of our cards back into our hand and now we are able to play them.
Yeah.
That's not the way Dominion works. That's not the way that Viscounts work. Rather, like once you refresh your discard pile, you now have a deck and you may draw a certain number of cards from that deck that then becomes your hand.
Yeah. You've
And
changed
there,
your probabilities.
yeah. And so there's a lot of randomness in terms of like what you draw then. And that randomness is in this kind of weird space that, a lot of times is mostly is going to be considered input randomness, in that it's kind of like the idea is, okay, you've drawn your hand. This is your situation now. Make decisions accordingly, right? Like
Yeah.
the random setup of Dominion has a lot of, not Dominion, of Concordia has a lot of input randomness. So like, here's our random setup of the board, make decisions accordingly.
Well,
Uh,
it's funny. What aspect of deck building feels more like deck building to me than anything else in Gloomhaven is the way you tweak your modifier deck. That to
mhm.
me feels like classic deck building, right? So your modifier deck is basically your loaded dice that, every time you take an attack, you're going to draw a card off this and it's going to tell you if you missed, if you critted, or if, your attack went up a couple or down a couple. But as you level up, you can start taking out cards. So it's almost like if you had a D6, and as you get stronger, you say, well, I'm going to lose the 1 and replace it with a 2. So now at least I'll never roll a 1. Or, I'm going to I'm going to make, 3 and 4 both 4s, but now I have 2 1s in my deck. Or, so to me, that is classic deck building, and that I'm trying to tweak the probabilities in a way that that benefits my play style.
Yeah, I agree, and that's kind of where I started on this whole thing. Was I was looking at these distinctions, and then I kind of realized, like, wait a second, am I thinking about, when I'm thinking about Gloomhaven, am I thinking about the wrong deck? Like, is
Yeah.
it actually the modifier deck that they're talking about with deck building? And I think like this was also like when I was, just thinking about Gloomhaven from a design perspective, like the modifier deck, like I don't know if I really like it. I mean, in I'm not saying it's wrong. Like for one thing, like Gloomhaven occupies this weird space where it's a dungeon crawler. It's semi RPG ish. It's not like true RPG ish, but there's plenty of games where I'm sure rather than having a modifier deck, you just roll a die,
Yeah.
and instead it gives you this deck, and then as you level you can modify it and kind of craft it to whatever you're doing with your character, but you're mostly just improving it.
Just making it
And
better. Yeah.
yeah, I remember from your review, like you were talking about the moments where you miss, like there's a
Oh,
single miss card in the deck.
yeah. If you draw that miss card on your big turn where you're blowing your one-time use card, that's your bomb card, and you've put everything on this, and this is the whole scenario depends on you dealing the damage necessary to kill the boss with your bomb card that you've purposefully not used the entire game, and that's a miss, no. That's so not fun that I just will cheat. That's how not fun it is.
Right.
That to me is no. I will just like literally I'll before I turn the card, I go, if this is the miss, I'm just reshuffling.
I'm
Because
out.
no.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
just no. That's not
Right.
you've ruined my whole game. No.
So that's a question, and I'd be curious to hear from people listening to the podcast of like, I'd like to hear a defense for why is this card there? Like why does it have to have a miss? And like I was starting to think about this, and it was like, is this something that's left over from like the RPG Dungeons and Dragons bones of this whole dungeon crawler, genre here? Is like, do you need to have, because like obviously there are crits in this game. There's the times where you flip the times two, and then as you build your deck up later with modifiers, there's some other times where it's like, oh, I've added this one card and it's going to give me a fire and a water thing so that my abilities will really trigger now going forward. Like it gives you the opportunity for crits, and like those crits are fun. The what we used to call fumbles in D&D, like the fumbles aren't fun, but like there was a place for it in a role-playing game. Like when you're playing a role-playing game and you're telling a story, a lot of times the epic fails are really interesting.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
Paul's whole thing about like recreating memories, and like epic fails in a role-playing game can be wonderful. They're the kind of things you're
Totally.
still talking about years later.
Couldn't agree more.
But it seems out of place in Gloomhaven.
Yeah. There's nothing fun about having to replay scenario 14B again.
And I'm not going
Like
to do
that,
it, right? Like I'm
no,
like
I'm
you,
never
like
gonna. I'm
I'm
not
not
gonna.
going
That
to
was
do it.
2 hours. I'm not doing that again. My time is too precious to me. Also, like I will just say, I know all the experienced Gloomhaven players are going. Well, yeah. Well, before you make that huge, super important turn, you better make sure you have advantage so that you are drawing two cards. And my response to that is, that's the same as me cheating. You're agreeing with me that under no circumstance will you allow a miss to happen on that turn, in which case I go back to Trey's question is why is that card in the game?
And I think there may be good reasons for it. I'm just not sure I understand it. Like I remember there was a really good article from Richard Garfield, who I'm stealing all of my thoughts about randomness. They're all just cribbed from Richard Garfield. But I mean, he specifically was looking back at, I think, a designer diary on Team Fortress 2. And they were looking at that game and the point in their own development where they had not a lot of chance in the game, that it was a fairly straightforward shooter at one point, and then they started to put a high degree of randomness into various shots you took, where you could both miss very rarely or crit, um, somewhat rarely, and all of a sudden the game just innately became more fun. Like crazier stuff just started to happen, and you got these kind of explosions of randomness and crazy stuff happening that just translated to fun. So, I've raised an eyebrow a few times when Dimitri has said that like I'm anti-randomness. I'm not. Like randomness has a lot of really important functions in games, and that's a whole different subject. But I guess what I'm saying is like it should have the right kind of randomness. And whether it's you whiff on something and now I've got to restart the scenario, boy, that wasn't fun, I want to quit. I had a number of moments playing Gloomhaven where the bad guys whiffed in a sense that
Mm-hmm.
also took the fun out. And it wasn't even necessarily that they flipped a miss card. It was like playing certain scenarios where there's a boss monster,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're flipping their little AI cards of what action they're going to pursue, sometimes they have a choice between like healing themselves or healing all other allies.
Right.
And like you flip the card that says, okay, the boss this turn is healing all allies. Well, all of the other allies in certain scenarios, like they're already at full hit points and you don't care because you need to kill
Yeah.
the boss first before,
He just gave you a free turn.
it just gave you a free turn. It's like, boy, this scenario just got real easy because like
Mm-hmm.
in a sense that's the same thing. Like the randomness in this game just produced something that made no sense and made it unfun. Like making the game too easy is not fun either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Gloomhaven is famous for doing well the idea that every scenario comes down to like one card flip and like you
Mm-hmm.
either win or lose. Like it does that really well. Like that tension is there.
It scales really well, right?
Yeah, and more often than not you do find yourself like, well, we either win or lose this turn. But I'll just say that every time I lose, I pretend I won because I'm not going to do it again. Because there's literally nothing fun for me about doing something again when the only difference between winning and losing was the flip of a card, and not like it's not like, well, I'm going to get that much better on the next one. Like I did it right. It's supposed to come down to a coin toss, and okay, cool. I lost. To me, it's just like, all right, there's just nothing new for me to explore there and playing it again to see if I get the coin toss right. So
Yeah. So I guess the final thing I would say on this is like that was a frustration when we played Viscounts, which I'm sure we'll have a review of that coming up relatively soon, where things that should feel like input randomness ended up in effect being output randomness. Where like that additional step in Viscounts where like I've got my deck and now I'm drawing my up to my hand size to see what I can do next turn. Like you in that game you buy other cards, and like I had certain cards that were going to define my strategy, and when I didn't draw them when I'm drawing back up after resetting my deck, if I don't draw those, that feels like a whiff, like that's a miss in a sense. And what's supposed to be an input random decision is now is an output. Like this happens in Dominion too, where like you want to buy a certain card, so like I want to see a bunch of gold cards, I didn't, that's a whiff in terms of your turn a lot of times. And like you could see, like you could interject this stage into Concordia, where rather than drawing up your entire hand of actions, rather you shuffle and draw the top five. But like that wouldn't be a better game.
yeah.
So I'm just saying, like, make sure, maybe the final note may be like, make sure that the mechanisms in your game are actually doing what you want them to do.
Yeah, no, that's and it's interesting. I think about this a lot because, and this is one of the reasons that I'm very glad that I don't design board games because I have no good answers for it, really. But I know when I'm experiencing it and when I'm not. Like a game like Kingdom Death Monster is not wildly dissimilar from Gloomhaven in its experience, but I relish a loss in Kingdom Death Monster. I have no problem with losing. In fact, a total whiff on a die roll in the last thing is fine because I really because each time like you don't feel like you're redoing the scenario. In fact, the next one is going to be very different. You know your path to get back to the boss will be different. It's the loop in that one doesn't feel like you're just having to do the level over again. And to me,
Well,
Gloomhaven,
how's
if
it?
you
I
lose,
don't. I don't know the game well enough. How is it different? You're not
well,
just repeating the scenario. What makes it different in this game?
the whole game is the loop. And the loop is go to town, level up your town so that things in town get better, so that your probabilities get better of making better heroes. Pick your team that's going to go out, and you can pick different members of your team that are better at different things. Everybody has different psychoses and like emotional issues. And so the team you pick, like, could be a whole bunch of cowards who are really strong, or a whole bunch of weak people who are really smart, or a combination of. So like always that putting that group together is very different.
Oh,
And
okay.
then when you embark on, so there's the town building section, then there's the journey to the boss, and the journey to the boss is a random events series of events that's different every time off this huge deck, and that totally has a different feel to it, so that by the time you get to the boss, your team is in a different shape because that path to the boss will either mess you up, or usually a combination of hurting you and giving you boons, so that by the time you get to the boss, it feels like it has a roguelike feeling, like a
Mhm.
roguelike video game where it's like, yes, you're doing the same thing, but it comes out in such a different random order every time that you relish the differences. You know what I mean? Whereas in Gloomhaven, the only real difference will be, maybe a tweak of my strategy and the way, a different flip of the card. But I don't relish the loop in Gloomhaven. What I relish is progression.
Yeah, in
And so
Gloomhaven, it's more like you went to your last save point. right? It's more like a video.
Exactly. Right.
Like, I guess
Exactly.
you could
And
I guess you could tweak your skills and say, "I need more movement," or something like that, but you're really just going back to a save point.
right. To me, I guess it's like an agreement I have with the game at the beginning. Like in Gloomhaven, my agreement is progression, character growth, getting stronger, seeing more story. In Kingdom Death, it's seeing more of the game while experiencing the same loop. So it's like the more loops I do, the more I see, and that to me is what's fun. Whereas in Gloomhaven, I want to get to the end, and it's like, and I'm not, I don't want to go back. Going back's not fun. So
There's
maybe that's the
my
distinction.
final thought on this, maybe also, and I don't have answers on this, but like this is an area where like this game is really really different from an RPG in that like the loop, as you say here. I feel like when you're really playing Gloomhaven, you are on that knife's edge all the time of failing your a scenario. And in fact, it's probably part of the game where like if you played through and you never failed, you're probably not doing it right. Right.
Oh,
Like
totally.
you're not on the right difficulty uh adjustment. And so you want that to be right on the edge every time, because that's when it's at its best, is when you just barely succeeded. But that's so different than an RPG where, if you actually played a scenario out and everyone failed, like that's a total party kill. Like that's in RPG land, like there's a term for it, total party kill. Like that could be the end of your group. Everybody went
Yeah.
their separate ways
That could be the end of relationships.
after then. And I think like one of those things you're always juggling when you're playing an RPG is like, oh, this is going poorly. Should we run? Like, should we bail?
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
so it just ends up creating these like different loops. And I'm kind of going back to the whole idea of crits and fumbles, is that like, is there something about output randomness that's essential in an RPG? And I know that a lot of indie RPGs like don't have that much chance in them now, but a lot of them still do. But like part of it is that like success and failure in an RPG is becoming like less and less of the point. But maybe at original D&D it was, but it just feels more at home, where the epic fails can be just as interesting as the epic successes. But even then, like you think about like the core, like because you DM D&D because you wanted to know what it was like. But like
Yeah.
your core loop and I think about this just in terms of like narrative design or games design. Like if you're playing a core D&D loop or like core RPG loop, at least old school RPGs, is like the DM says, "What do you want to do?" And the player then articulates what they want to do. Like, I want to do such an action. Like, and the most basic one is I'm going to attack. But it can be I'm going to climb the walls, I'm going to pickpocket, I'm going to cast this spell. And then, like if it's in question, then the DM says, well, it sounds like you're doing a blah blah check. Roll to succeed. Player rolls. Did you hit or miss? Did you succeed? Was it a crit? Was it a failure? Was it a fumble? Did something really bad happen? But like that's your loop
Yeah.
in the game. And like that's incredibly flexible loop that's great for telling stories. And
Yeah.
it's even
And
like
a good DM job is to keep the illusion of that, barely surviving loop going over and over again.
yeah. And you also like you want the thing, like even if it's like the thing they're going to do, like a lot of times you have people do skill checks on stuff that they're going to succeed on, even because like you just want
Oh
them
yeah.
referencing their skills.
Yeah. And there's a reason that DMs roll dice behind their shields. It's
Mm-hmm.
because they get to decide whatever the die says.
All right, that's what I got.
I love it. That was awesome. Thank you, Trey. Um,
Yeah, let's hear from
uh,
people in the community
yeah, we have
though.
a lot of Gloomhaven players out there, a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to keep an open mind about like I'd love to hear a great defense of the whiff. And I know
Yeah.
probably like as you thin your modifier deck, you got to have that thing to keep players honest or whatever. And there are good design questions that go into having that there, but just from emotional response, it seems bad, man.
Yeah, I would like to hear from players who relish a loss,
Yeah,
who don't mind it at all, and are like, "Yes, let's do this scenario again. I cannot
In
wait."
Defense of Failure by
Yeah,
Edmund England or something.
yeah, exactly. Hit us up. Hey, if you enjoyed that video, you very well might enjoy the other videos you now see being suggested to you on screen. Also, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, or subscribe to our Game Brain channel. Thanks so much.